In the rulebooks for D&D 5e, there are a lot of random additions on a whole bunch of pages, which list variant rules that can be added to whatever they're talking about currently in order to make things more interesting. So in this list, we'll be going over a lot of those extra variant rules you can add to your game, which are listed in official D&D sources. And at number 10, we have hitting cover. The variant rule for this only applies when adding extra AC for cover. The ruling is, if there is something in between you and the target you're trying to hit, the target will have either half cover, which gives them +2 to their AC, 3/4 cover, which gives them +5 to their AC, or full cover, which means you can't hit them. And the most common things that provide half cover is just other characters on the battlefield. So if you're trying to shoot a creature that has one other creature in front of it, then the creature has half cover by default. Or your DM can rule 3/4 cover depending on the situation, like if it's a vastly bigger creature than the other creature. So if a creature had an AC of 15 normally, and you tried to shoot your bow at it and roll a 16, normally that would be good enough to hit. However, adding a half cover, they gain extra +2 to their AC, so you would actually miss with their new AC at 17. And then with hitting cover, the variant rule, what this means is that if your attack roll misses because of cover, it instead hits whatever is providing the cover, assuming the attack roll is also able to hit that. So in this scenario, if the creature providing the half cover has an AC that's below 16, they are hit instead by the attack instead of your intended target. Without the variant rule, the attack would just miss and nothing else happens. This variant rule sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is, and is overall not super impactful to a normal battlefield, but it is a pretty neat variant rule you can add, and definitely makes sense within the context of the world. So I thought I would add this to this video if only at the number 10 spot. There are much more impactful rules later on in this video. And at number 9, we have skills with different attributes. This is a variant rule which simply states, if you're trying to perform a skill check, you can use one of your other various attributes for that skill instead of the default one. For example, if you're proficient in athletics, and you need to do a marathon swim from an offshore island to the mainland, your DM can ask you to roll a constitution-based athletics check to signify you're using stamina in order to make it that far, rather than a strength-based athletics check, which would normally be the default. Or probably one of the more common ways to use this variant rule is if you're a big burly character trying to make an intimidation check. You can allow them to use strength as the attribute instead of charisma, which is the default. In fact, a lot of games already use this variant rule, but only for intimidation in this specific case. But technically, the variant rule allows you to do it for pretty much every ability, just as long as the DM okays it. And at number 8, we have automatic success. This is a rule which is different from passive skills and basically means if you're trying to do an ability check, instead of performing a roll for it, you can just automatically succeed if your score on that check is 5 higher than the DC. So, for example, say you need to break down a door which would have a DC of 15, and your character has a 20 strength score. You could use this variant rule to automatically break that door without any roll, because 20 minus 5 equals 15, and you'd be able to automatically succeed. This is a rule in order to kind of skip rolls on things that your character should never really fail at, like a 20 strength character being able to break down a wooden door. However, it only applies to ability checks and doesn't apply to saving throws, attack rolls, or contests, where two characters would roll against each other. There is also an additional part of this variant rule which states if you are proficient in a tool, you can also automatically succeed on tool checks if the DC is 10 or less. But if your character is level 11 or higher, then your character can automatically succeed on tools checks that are of DC of 15 or less. So automatic success is actually pretty hard to activate, since you need to beat the initial check by a 5 with your base score, but it definitely makes sense that you'd be able to succeed something automatically if your attribute in that skill is 5 higher than the DC. Part of the reason this is only an optional rule is because DMs or players might want a risk of failure, and smart players will just try to match whatever character has the highest ability score to whatever problem they're currently facing for an automatic success, and it might take some of the fun out of the game. And at number 7, we have the Disarm rule. The Disarm action is a special combat option which makes it so you can disarm a foe you're fighting by attacking the weapon in their hand instead of the creature themselves. And the way you do this is you roll an attack roll like normal, except the target is the weapon you're trying to disarm instead of the creature. Although it still counts as targeting a creature, so you don't have to worry about rulings about what can or can't target a certain item or creature. Then, the creature you target for the disarm has to make either an athletics or acrobatics check, where if that check is a higher roll than your attack roll, the disarm fails. However, if your attack roll is higher than the skill check and you win the contest, then the attack causes no damage or ill effects, but it causes the defender to drop their item. And also, you have disadvantage on the attack roll if the creature is holding the weapon with 2 hands, or if the creature is of a size larger than you. But you have advantage on the attack roll if the creature is of a size smaller than you. Now, the main problem with the Disarm combat option is that Battlemaster's fighters kind of have an ability similar in their class. Although overall, the Battlemaster Disarm is better, so it's not exactly the same, and would probably be fine to add to any game, as it's just an option you can do instead of doing damage. And at number 6, we have another combat option called Mark. Mark is a special ability that doesn't require any other actions other than meeting the conditions, where if you make a melee attack against a creature, you can choose to designate that creature as your mark. What this means is, until the end of your next turn, any opportunity attacks you make against that target have advantage. And also, the biggest part of the mark variant rule, making an opportunity attack against the mark creature does not use up your reaction. So your reaction is free to do other things, just as long as it's not making another opportunity attack, because the mark variant rule does limit you to only 1 opportunity attack per turn, if you choose to use the mark option. Which means if you have something like the shield spell or counter spell, 2 things that also use up your reaction, you'd be able to do either of those things and still have your opportunity attack from the mark. Assuming the opportunity attack was only against the marked creature, and assuming you are able to do it because there is another rule where, if you have some condition which would normally allow you to not perform an opportunity attack, like being incapacitated or being affected by the Shocking Grasp spell, you can't perform this extra opportunity attack. So the mark feature is straight up buff to melee characters, and seeing how much more powerful spellcasters are in comparison to melee characters, it's probably fine to add in an average game that's going to the higher levels. And at number 5, we have a dual spot with Tumble and Overrun variant rules. Basically, what these 2 rules entail are giving you a way to move through an enemy creature's space. Overrun allows you to use your strength score to go through an enemy creature's space, and Tumble just uses your dexterity. And they both go about it in slightly different ways and have some slightly different rules. For Tumble, you can use an action or bonus action in order to perform an acrobatics check contested by the enemy creature's acrobatics check. And if you win the contest, you're able to move through their space 1 time this turn as if it's difficult terrain, since there's rulings in other parts of the book that go over what happens when you move through another creature's space, where it's counted as difficult terrain, even if it's not listed in this variant rule itself. Then with Overrun, you can also use an action or bonus action in order to perform an athletics contest with the creature you're trying to move through their space of. And if you win the athletics contest, which you have advantage on if you're larger than the creature, or disadvantage if you're smaller, you're able to just move through the creature's space once this turn. But you can't move them to one side or anything. It literally just lets you go through their space. So if you want rules for being able to go through enemy creature spaces, they exist with the Overrun and Tumble variant rules. And at number 4, we have Cleaving through creatures. This is another variant rule which gives buff to melee characters, as what it does is, if you're fighting some low-level monsters, and you have a really big battle axe and it's doing a whole bunch of damage, you can apply that damage to other creatures nearby if the damage overkills your target. For example, say you're a high-level barbarian and you're attacking a horde of goblins, and you're completely surrounded. The goblin has an average hit point value of 7, and let's say through a bunch of modifiers, having the Great Weapon Master feat, and rolling a maximum value on that weapon, you get something like a 25 on the damage roll. And your attack roll is high enough to beat the AC of that goblin, so you're able to kill that goblin in 1 hit. And that would normally be the end of that action. But with this variant rule, what you would instead do is continue the damage, where you would go to the next nearest target of your choice, and then if the initial attack roll would also meet the AC of that target, you can then apply any additional damage to them. So if it's another goblin, you would subtract another 7 from the initial amount. So the first goblin would take 7 off of the 25, leaving you with 18 damage left over. The second goblin would bring that down to 11, and you could just keep going to another nearby creature as long as they're within range. Where the next goblin would bring it down to 4, and then the last goblin would only take 4 damage, as that's all that's left from the initial attack. So an attack which would normally only kill 1 goblin, in this instant kills 3.5 of them. Now, the problem with cleaving through enemies rule is that it makes hordes of small creatures less deadly. Although spellcasters get rid of hordes of low-level creatures way easier than this rule does, and it's not like you're doing extra damage, just actually using all of the damage of your big hits. So it's probably a fine rule to add because it only applies to melee characters, and would still make them less useful than a spellcaster using any AoE spell. Although, with the added bonus that it's basically a walking AoE machine with this feature that doesn't have any resource restrictions tied to it like an AoE spellcaster would. And at number 3, we have healing surges. This is a great variant rule to add to a party that doesn't have any healers, or to a party that doesn't want to have anyone forced to play healer. As what it does is gives every creature the action where they can spend up to half of their hit die, and for each hit die spent, gain hit points equal to that total. So, normally you would spend hit die during a short rest in order to heal up for some amount. This variant rule simply allows you to do this as an action whenever you want, which includes during combat. However, there are some limitations to this. You can only use this healing surge once per short or long rest. So you can't continuously use all of your hit die in multiple battles, unless you take a short rest in between each one of them. There's also some extra bonuses to how you acquire hit dice, where after a short rest you regain hit dice equal to your level divided by 4, or a minimum of 1, and you regain all of your spent hit dice after a long rest. So you're just going to have more hit dice than normal, as normally you only regain half of your hit die after a long rest, and that's it. And you can also use your hit die during a short rest just like normal. And since you gain hit dice back after a short rest anyway with this variant rule, it just adds to a lot more healing to your characters than they would normally have access to naturally, as they can, once every rest, use an action to heal themselves for quite a bit if they spend the full amount of hit die they're allowed to. Then they can spend the rest of them after a short rest and get a fourth of them back, and then have a fourth of them to use in the next battle, which they can get back again after a short rest. And then eventually you just get them all back after a long rest. And this variant rule even has another option, which says you can let characters use Healing Surge as a bonus action rather than an action if you want your characters to feel like superheroes. So I would highly suggest allowing this variant rule in games with low healing, and probably not allowed in games which have more than enough of that already, since healers do like to be able to actually heal if they're playing it by choice. But nobody wants to be forced to be a healer because no one else wanted to pick one, which is probably what this variant rule is meant for. And at number 2, we have flanking. This is a variant rule that I've been using in pretty much every game I've ever played, but I'm not sure how many other tables actually use it, because I heard it's not as common. Basically, what this rule means is if you're in melee with an enemy creature, and there's another creature on the opposite side of that creature which is an ally, you and your ally have advantage on that creature, so long as you have multiple allies which get in melee range for whatever reason, or even summon player companions. It's pretty easy for a melee character with this variant rule to get advantage more often than not, which is why a lot of tables don't allow the flanking variant rule, because it makes advantage too easy to get as a melee character. In fact, I've heard a whole bunch of homebrew nerfs to this variant rule to only make flanking grant a bonus to the attack roll with a numerical value, rather than just giving straight advantage, because it's real easy to get flanking, as you don't actually need to be directly on an opposite side of the other, just as long as you're able to draw an imaginary line through you and your ally, and that imaginary line touches the creature, or just a quarter of the enemy space, then the enemy creature is considered flanked, which means it's super easy to gain flanking on creatures that are of a size large or bigger, a little bit more difficult to flank creatures that are medium or smaller. And since I use this ruling so much, and I've used it in other games in places where I wasn't the DM, I used to think it was just a default rule in the game, so I would obviously suggest it to everyone else. And at number 1, we have hero points. Hero points are an ability score option, which means it adds an extra stat point to all the characters, similar to adding an insanity score or an honor score. However, the way hero points work are a lot more simple than all the other additional attributes you can give to characters, because basically, what hero points do is, you can spend 1 hero point after you make a d20 roll in order to add an additional 1d6 to it, which can be applied either to an attack roll, an ability check, or a saving throw. Additionally, if you're specifically performing a death saving throw, you can spend a hero point in order to make that failure into a success, rather than adding a d6 to the roll. And you can choose to spend the hero point after you've made the roll, but before you know the outcome of that roll. So hero points are really strong. They basically just give you an extra d6 to whatever critical roll you're about to perform, and you can choose to spend it after you've known you've rolled pretty low, but not low enough where you know you're automatically going to fail, and give you a chance to succeed that roll instead. And a character starts with 5 hero points at level 1, and you don't gain any new hero points until you level up. And then after you level up, your hero point score is just reset, where you gain 5 plus half your character's level. This is to incentivize actually using the hero points and not saving them up every level, and also, due to the generous amount you do get, you should be able to use them pretty liberally. Where if you're a level 2 character, you get 6 hero points, A level 8 character will have 9 hero points, etc, etc. And hero points basically allow your character to just feel more heroic by giving them an extra chance to succeed at all of their basic roles, which obviously highlights the big problem with hero points, in that it just makes characters way stronger than normal. Hero points absolutely break the balance of the game, especially in shorter games which level up very quickly. If you're playing a game where it takes you a year to level up, then hero points aren't that big a deal, and could probably be added without breaking any kind of balance. If you're playing a game where you level up once every other session, then your character will have an almost endless supply of hero points in order to spend on everything they do. However, the main benefit of hero points is alleviating some of the RNG that happens with playing the game, and allowing characters to actually feel like special heroes, rather than being left to the devices of random chance of the d20s and their normal, standard ability scores. It would make sense for a hero to have a little bit more luck than normal in a story, and hero points just kind of give you a little bit more luck than normal, but without making characters stronger by default, or just lowering the power level of everything else in the game. And characters have to make a conscious effort in order to gain that little bit more luck. So it's a great way to just make your characters feel more heroic without having the DM to fudge any of their dice rolls. I think hero points are an excellent addition to a game where you're just trying to have fun, and you don't want the characters to have a bad time because they get too many bad rolls in a row. But if you're playing a more serious game that levels up quickly, it's probably best this is a variant rule that you just ignore instead. And since it's such a good system for just a more casual setting, or a game that has a shorter level up times, I definitely think it's an excellent variant rule you can possibly add to your game, which will probably change the game a lot more than any of the other variant rules I've talked about so far, save probably flanking, where it makes melee characters way more powerful. Alright, and that's the list. There are quite a bit of variant rules in the game, and I also completely skipped over feats and multi-classing, because those are variant rules that are used by pretty much everyone, that a lot of people already know about. So, if you know of any other variant rule that I may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.